Hello and welcome to World History Unit 6, the Russian Revolution. All of Unit 6 and Unit 7 is going to be focused almost entirely on World War II, how it happened, what happened during the war, and what happened after the war. The reason why we're going to spend so much time on World War II is because the events leading up to World War II, and of course the events immediately after it, began to set the tone and shape international relationships between America and every other country in the world for almost the rest of the entire 20th century. So with that said, let's go ahead and go back to early 20th century into Russia. Now, Russia in the early 20th century, before World War I, was still ruled by a king. Now, they didn't call it a king. In Russia, it was known as a czar. And the czar at the time was Nicholas II. He ruled from 1894 to 1917. And for the early part of his rule, he was looked upon as a champion of the people. Most of the people hated the people that were underneath him, the leaders that were underneath him, but they loved the king, the czar, for the beginning of his term. Towards the end, he became very unpopular as he began to more strictly censor music and literature. He formed Russia's earliest secret police. He began to use those secret police to arrest people for their political views that were against his own beliefs and decisions on how the country should be run. Another controversial thing he did was to make Russian the official language that must be used across the land. Now, that didn't sit very well with the Polish people who lived there for generations upon generations, not speaking Russian, living just fine in the land of Russia, and now they're being told that they can't speak their language anymore. That's going to cause some problems with the Polish. He also began to raise taxes to prepare for wars. He began to outlaw unions because they hurt productivity of the factories that he needed to support the war he was going to bring the country into, World War I. And also contributing to people's general mood of maybe wanting a different way of life or different leadership was low wages that they were getting paid, child labor, poor working conditions in the jobs they could get. All of these things were the perfect recipe, or the perfect storm, one might say, for what would be one of the bloodiest revolutions in European history, or at least for the last 25 years. Now, when I said earlier that people were very unhappy with some of the other leaders of Russia that were beneath the Tsar but still had a lot of power, none were anywhere near as unpopular as a man named Rasputin. Rasputin was a self-described holy man who claimed to have magical healing powers, and he befriended Russian Tsarina Alexandra and was allowed by her, the queen of all of Russia, to make key political decisions because he convinced her he could magically cure her son of hemophilia, which is a disease in which if you get cut, you'll bleed and your body isn't able to heal that cut very rapidly, which can cause death if that blood is not stopped soon enough, which is very difficult to do. But what the Tsarina, the queen of Russia, didn't notice, and neither did her husband, or at least they didn't care about it, was all of the people that were his friends that he was giving power to. People that the citizens of Russia felt were abusive, were contributing to their poor quality of life, and overall just made Rasputin public enemy number one after the king himself. In fact, he was so hated that he was found murdered, drowned, shot in 1916. Now, to go back to the citizens of Russia were beginning to think that they wanted a different system of government. They no longer wanted a king. So many empires in Europe and of course over in America had gotten rid of kings and had democracies and other ways of government, and Russians were also looking for that new way of government. government. But rather than look to democracy, they looked to a couple different leaders who had very, very different views of how people can be liberated from kings. One of those leaders was Karl Marx. Karl Marx wrote something called the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto explained what it meant to be a communist. In this case, he says the proletariats or workers are enemies. They work against capitalists. Capitalists being the type of economy that you'll see in countries like the United States of America. He believed that revolution was inevitable. The workers, the proletariats, had to rise up against their employers, against their rulers, and that they should be the ones to rule everything, not have some government leadership, not have some ruler or even elected official, but the people themselves should be in charge. He believed that all wealth, land, everything should be owned and distributed equally among all people. Societies should be classless, where everything is shared among the people. The other important leader at the time was Vladimir Lenin. Now, Lenin also believed in the proletariat or workers versus capitalism. But he did not believe that the proletariat, the peasants, the workers were capable of leading a revolution, and that they actually did need a leader, which went against Karl Marx's beliefs, to start that revolution to finally achieve that communist dream, that communist goal of a classless society where everybody has the same amount of wealth and privilege. And Lenin felt the best way to achieve that goal, that dream, was that after the revolution, rather than immediately giving up power to the people, power would be held by a single political party, which would then control its government and all the people, looking more and more like a dictatorship. But even though Lenin's ideas about how the revolution would come about was different than Marx, he still claimed to be a follower of Marx. And so his followers, his revolutionaries, were considered to be Marxist revolutionaries, and he used a lot of the same language, such as calling peasants and workers the proletariat, who he believed should overthrow the Tsar, the King of Russia. When it came time to actually set off the revolution, his group of followers was known as the Bolsheviks, which was a radical group willing to sacrifice everything, their lives, their country, their families, everything, whatever it took to overthrow the Tsar and change Russia for the better. Now, unfortunately for Lenin, he had to do most of his work getting the revolution fired up, organized, ready to go from outside of the country, because he was exiled from Russia for his beliefs, for his writings in 1897. And it wouldn't be until it was finally time to strike out against the Tsar in 1917, as the World War I began to end, that he finally was able to return home, at least without having to hide. So you heard me say earlier that the king, when he first took over, when he first became the Tsar, he was very popular, and then things changed. Well, on screen are a few of the things that happened that caused that change. First was the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905, in which case Russia and Japan competed for control of Korea and Manchuria, which is part of China. The nations signed agreements over the territories, but Russia broke them. Japan, understandably upset, retaliated, kicked their butts so bad that the people back home weren't mad at the Japanese, they were mad at their own leaders for getting them involved in a war that they didn't really want to be involved in, and then ended up losing many, many Russian lives. Unfortunately, this would not be the last time that people would suffer and die under the leadership of Tsar Nicholas. Next up is Bloody Sunday, the Revolution of 1905. 200,000 workers protested in front of the Tsar's palace, partially because of the losses of the Russo-Japanese War, but also because of the declining working conditions and pay and some of those other factors that were going on in Russia that were contributing to a revolutionary mode. Well, Nicholas II didn't want to hear any of that, and he ordered soldiers to fire on a crowd of workers petitioning for these better working conditions. And more than 1,000 were wounded and several hundred people were killed by soldiers. This provoked a wave of strikes across Russia in protest of the killings, just firing people up even more against the government and especially the king. And then finally in 1914, Russia entered yet another war, World War I, a war nobody in Russia wanted to be involved in, and they were unprepared to do so to begin with. As a result of this war they were not prepared for, and most of the people didn't even want to be involved with to begin with, more than 4 million Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. It's safe to say that the Russian people were ready for a change, and with so many of them dead or dying under the leadership of Tsar, they felt they had nothing left to lose, which is a surefire reason to start a revolution. And under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, that's exactly what happened. In 1917, the March Revolution led by Lenin and the Bolsheviks exploded across Russia. They successfully overthrew the Tsar and set up a brand new government. Lenin and the Bolsheviks first ordered that all farmland be distributed among the peasants to use how they see fit. They also gave all control of factories to the workers that worked in them, removing their employers from power. And finally, they signed a truce with Germany to stop all fighting in World War I immediately, so that no more Russians would die in a war that they did not believe in. But of course, that wasn't enough for the people when it came to the Tsar Nicholas himself. He was found a year after he was kicked out of power and executed along with his entire family. Lenin, returning from exile, set up the provisional temporary government until he could set up a more permanent government, which would later be known as the USSR. One of those S's stands for Soviets, which are local councils consisting of workers, peasants, and soldiers. And supposedly, it would be these local councils that would determine how factories, how farmland, how all businesses, and how all resources would be distributed, effectively giving all power to the people. But this government proved to be fairly inefficient and ineffective, so Lenin and the leaders that followed him consolidated power among one central leadership that would make all decisions for the entire Russian nation. And that's all there is to talk about the Russian Revolution. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about exactly what Russian communism under the Soviets would look like.